to episode 26 of Malcolm Show. Today I've been thinking more about sensoriums and how they connect with marketing as a conduit of language, aka the mathematical nature of the universe. So I've been thinking about it more from the perspective of how language works as a cosmological conduit of intention. So because everything we say to each other effectively communicates a behaviour at the physiological level and has an emergent quality at the psychological level, then there's a syntactic equivalency found through language. So because of the syntactic equivalency found through language, linguistic principles such as pragmatics and semantics, as well as the obvious syntactic unifier between linguistics, mathematics and other semiotic principles of communication, it becomes easier for us to then define how language is a consistent parameter, it's a consistent parenthesis of perception through which humanity can identify reality. What that essentially means is because language serves as a parenthetical conduit, essentially if you think of a ray of light as being an emergent energy from its source, such as a ray of light from the sun, or a light bulb, or the smile of your favourite person, that emergent ray can be concentrated until it eventually becomes a laser, for instance, or just a narrower beam of light, in the same sense that general intelligence can find applications of its intellect until specializing, aka a narrow intelligence. So if we continue this idea throughout language and think about it from a marketing perspective, that's the same idea as, I think, very, very generally speaking, a brand image, such as a fast food chain or a sportswear brand or a supermarket. These brands all have language as part of their brand narrative and brand identity, which something I'm exploring is how brand narrative and brand identity are actually the same idea from different economies of scale, which in psychological terms are actually compared to be called narrative identity, which as a continuation has something to it called identity performance. Now, the important principle to remember here is that because language is multimodal, it can be communicated through kinesics, body language, it can be communicated through speech whenever we're vocalizing our thoughts, it can be communicated through written language. So whether that's with a pen on a piece of paper or via keyboard, either as buttons or a touchscreen, you are effectively communicating physiological sensations through a psychological funneling system, which is attempting to sift your intention from your actions. So with that, language effectively then becomes a continuation of physiology, and because it's a continuation of physiology, language then can become representative of physiology, which is what happens when you have body language. Whenever you're gesticulating with your fingers, your hands, or your arms, a whole unit, you're creating components of linguistic syntax in the kinesic modality, as it were. So those formations of narrative, because as we express ourselves with our bodies, we form a narrative conducive with identity. The narrative formed is that, for instance, if I keep my posture upright, then I'm expressing to the world that I feel confident in who I am. I might be asserting dominance in a way that's either psychological and subliminally systematized to the effect that, okay, everybody who I'm walking amidst understands that when I have this sort of posture, it is generally indicative of confidence. So you continue that idea consistently, then you can start communicating to the world as the person who you want to be, and the longer you communicate who you want to be the world, it's eventually who you are seen by. It is eventually how the world sees you. And we can look at the idea in digital environments as well as physical environments. So for instance, when we think of how phrase this? Multimodal expressions of language, such as body language, spoken language, written language, we are continuing an existing behavioral cycle because of the precedent set before us from either ancestral influence, whether that be parents and grandparents, siblings, cousins, it might be school teachers and classmates, it might be employers and colleagues. However that equivalency is found is a continuation of a linguistic choice, which in small part can be considered a physiological event, which can then be further specified as a biological neural network. The same idea can then be continuously thought of in technological terms as what's called an artificial neural network. Now for me the term artificial has syntactic issues to it because of the connotations of the term artificial. In this context we do understand how it is referring to computers and machines generally being given data as an input through various layers of throughput until resulting in an output. However, that precise description of what we would describe as an inert technology is also syntactically applicable to the human processes of consciousness. So the input being the sensorium's intake from its environment, the throughput being that process of digesting input and metabolizing calories to operate whichever, it might be auditory, it might be gustatory, it might be olfactory, it might be visual. Any of these sensory systems, part of the collective sensorium that constitutes the human being, is at the same time also something seen in technologies. So we're not that different from the computers we're around. And fun fact for anybody who is unaware, the term computer was originally used to describe humans who were exceptionally good at mathematics, and if I remember correctly, it was to describe mathematicians from Cambridge. So, if we continue that idea of syntactic equivalency, or perhaps pragmatic equivalency would be the correct term, then we then enter the notion of polysemy. So, the idea being that an equivalent term is obviously something such as an analogical vehicle or a metaphor or a synonym that conveys the idea in such a succinct manner that it's simplified for the recipient to understand. For instance, you might have a postdoctoral graduate explaining something to a 6-year-old, in which case it's the probability of the 6-year-old knowing all the vernacular relative to the subject at hand is it's less than 100% if we go probabilistically across the humans. It's also the idea that the more we understand how language is a conduit of physiological process, the more we understand that the multimodal encoding of language as a continuous behavior, then not only is it a useful way to look at it as a term of neural networks, it's also really useful to think of it in terms of waves. So the reason I find waves particularly helpful is the same idea that I find neural networks particularly helpful. So, neural networks and waves, because I'm sure many of you are aware, the brain has neural oscillations. It has brain waves. And because brain waves come to us in varying frequencies, so they can be, the delta waves being the slowest at 0.1 hertz to 4 hertz. We then get, next up with theta waves between 4 hertz and 7 hertz. Then we get alpha and nu waves between sort of approximately 7 to 13 hertz, alpha having a slightly narrower bandwidth there. And then after that we would get sensory motor brainwaves between 12.5 to 15.5 hertz. Then we get our beta waves, apparently the fastest, at 16 to 31 hertz. Sometimes even going faster. The idea is that equating these brainwave frequency bands with cerebral activity then gives us the notion of how much influence over our neural networks we have at any one time. So because we might find that at the higher levels of stimulation there is more neural activity, meaning that any messages encoded to us during higher levels of stimulation have greater effect. I would speculate, given my more rudimentary knowledge of physiology, that evolutionarily speaking, that became a component of human physiology because of the survival mechanisms connected with self-defense and sex. So if self-defense and sex being two modalities of heightened stimulation, then it makes sense that the patterns we learn during those periods of heightened awareness, we find greater encoding of behavior, or perhaps a stronger encoding of behavior, in the same sense that for anybody who trains martial arts knows that it doesn't matter whether you're grappling or striking, when you've got a tougher opponent you tend to be somewhat more switched on, but it can also be harder to focus on your most important moves because of the higher level of relative resistance. And if you're going up against somebody who's relatively comparably unskilled, then it becomes a far simpler sparring session, as it were. So, say for instance, you have a third degree Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt going up a fresh deal in white belt who's never trained any sport in their entire lives apart from what they were shown during PE lessons at school. The kinesic language emitted from the third degree black belt is then going to be so comprehensive in its continuation of tractability upon the white belt, I think it's linguistically correct, that it would be more of a, how complex a set of moves can I move together and how fluid can I make this sequence, to the point of not wanting to diminish the confidence in the white belt, whilst at the same time providing a sense of inspiration for what the sport of jiu-jitsu can do. In the same sense that if the postgraduate is speaking with the 6-year-old student, they want to inspire that sense of curiosity and magic and wonder about the world, in whatever the subject might be. It could be language, it could be mathematics, neuroscience, physics, psychology, whatever it is. The point stands is inspiring the kid, right? So the kid's then inspired to think, wow, this is really cool, I want to learn more, whether that be from the kinesic language of jiu-jitsu, spoken language of science in a general speak, or it could even be in the written language of you're posting something online and whoever ends up reading is like, oh, that's actually really interesting, I want to read more about that, I want to study more about that. And then, for all you know, that blog post you wrote 10 years ago actually inspires some kid to then become the most prolific scientist in their field of all time, winning a Nobel Prize and becoming his public speaker, and all these really, really, significantly impactful things upon the human race. So that's the power of language right there, and I'm trying to consolidate what I'm speaking about because I find it very easy to become excitable from, pardon me, conversational topic, because the physiological response I feel as a consequence of speaking about how I interpret the perceptual data available to my sensorium is very much that of complexity. There is a great deal of complexity going on in my mind, and that's not to describe myself as greater or lesser than anybody, because the complexity relative to me is complexity in the same sense of what's hard for you is hard for you. If it's your first day in the gym and you struggle to ever do a press up before, you're going to find bench pressing an empty barbell probably quite difficult. It's probably, yeah. If you've been bedridden for 6 months because of a lower body injury, walking is going to feel comparably difficult than to somebody who runs a marathon once a month. It's complexity, difficulty, hardness, they're all relative to the individual, which is why language is such a useful tool, because it can illuminate and it can obfuscate, it can consolidate as well as elaborate. The idea is that the more illumination you can express through language as a continuation of positive intention, so let's say constructive instead of destructive is our definitions of positive, as a slight, so I do this thing what I call is simplicical systems thinking, which is an idea of triangulation. Quick maths lesson for anybody who's unaware. So in geometry on a 2D plane you'd have points, you'd have lines, and then you'd get shapes such as triangles. And the simplicical system, aka simplexes, are these mathematical ways of representing data throughout a really big set of applications. So when you think about connecting ideas, let's say you've got a visual graph in front of you, you've got point A here, point B here, then point C up here, you can have, okay, there's line 1 from A to B, line 2 from B to C, line 3 from A to C, and boom, you've got your triangle. So then you think, okay, I've got this triangle, I've got these 3 ideas. For instance, on the board, you might be thinking how to coordinate your bishops with your knights, with your rooks, and create a really cohesive strategy. Sometimes you might be thinking how to connect your bishops with your knights, with your queen. It might be a different conglomeration of those 3 pieces. And the same idea that when we're thinking about communication of syntax, we might be thinking in computer science terms when we think about the programming language necessary to create machine learning tools such as a neural network. Or we might be thinking about various technical language in a linguistic piece if you're writing the documentation for that neural network, as well as the syntactic equivalency of the mathematical operations that are inherent to that neural network. So having the simplexes, those triangulations of idea, then continued into a 3D realm. So you'd have your, let's see, you've got your triangle here, and then turn this sideways, so it's 2D, 2D, still 2D in this idea, and then we have a third point here, then that third point is here, it's 1, 2, 3, and that creates what you could call tetrahedron, right? So it's a 3D triangle. Now, I'm sure for many of you who have seen these shapes before, it's a very simple idea. Some people haven't seen these shapes, and that's the idea of what's new to you might be hard for you. And that's okay. That's kind of the point of learning. If it's not complicated to you, you're probably not learning something new, or it might be, well, not necessarily, but if it's complicated to you, you might be learning something that's specifically important for you to learn because of its complexity, right? It's that your growth zones are at the edge of your comfort zones. So the idea I was getting across before is that the kinesic language, spoken language, written language trinity that I have is in effect a simplicical system axiom upon which other simplicial system axioms are connected. So that initial triangle might find another triangle, and then there might be 2 other triangles I have in my mind which I connect. So I have 4 triangles connected together, which effectively can start beginning a differently constructed tetrahedron, or even go on to start creating a hypertetrahedron, also known as a 5-cell, and start thinking in 4 dimensions. So whether you're aware of it or not, you are thinking in systems all of the time. That's just how the body works. So the more you're thinking in systems all the time, the more you are reinforcing the systematized behaviors you've taken on board. So language being a system, mathematics being a system, neuroscience being an observation of those systems. If we think of neural waves, the brainwaves I was discussing earlier, and their connection with neural networks as a learning tool, and neural oscillations as forms of waves that physics can describe, then effectively we start creating a larger chart from which we can start graphing the data, which in the same sense, when I was describing polysemic language as equivalencies, the chart for the data might simply be a doctoral thesis or a postdoctoral thesis or any sort of academic literature which is representative of either a logical treatise or contributions to a body of work and a continuation of existing research. So the further these ideas become elaborated upon, the further those who write about them and those who read about them understand the ideas at work. So if you're reading and writing to a degree of the postdoctoral level, some of these ideas are going to come really easily. But then if you're a kid on your first day of primary school and all of a sudden you're in math class and somebody starts throwing 4D shapes at you, it's, I mean, aesthetically really cool, mathematically mildly complex, and the idea of the system that I'm trying to delineate for you here and trying to describe for you is maybe unnecessarily complicated. Now, I really enjoy the complexities and I love challenging myself academically to be as comprehensively knowledgeable as possible. I really want to make sure that my intelligence is put to the most strenuous test it can be to, just, I like doing things that make me feel smart, and in the same way that I like doing physical behaviors that make me feel fast or strong or graceful, sort of thing. And one of the weaknesses I have that I'm trying to develop into behaving more, one of the weaknesses I'm trying to develop is my ability to stay on topic, because for me the tunnel vision that I feel I have when I'm describing these things is effectively a real-time description of the physiological processes as they're going through parts of my brain. And yet I know that when I communicate this data to other people, they're not hearing the same, they're hearing the same linguistic logic with a different cultural reference point. And I use the term cultural deliberately there because the idea of the cultural reference point that I'm elucidating is specifically that language is interpreted differently between a biological neural network and a technological neural network. And the idea that I'm trying to focus on more cohesively is that the intersections of these points, the overlap, the implications, are that all forms of neural network are an expression of consciousness. And all expressions of consciousness must, by definition, that would be indefinite, have some sort of means of processing consciousness via senses. So, to me, anything that can consciously process data and arrive at an internally generated conclusion fits the definition of consciousness. However, the sophistication of that consciousness is where I would argue there's an anthropocentric bias from human researchers. Anthropocentrism is a very, very common consequence in lots of human research, as would be the same idea of canine-centric or feline-centric focus from dogs and cats studying human beings or other primates or elephants or tigers or orcas or polar bears or sharks or whatever you pick, right? The important element to remember here is that everything we're doing is part of a system. And that system has macrocosmic application, it has microcosmic application. And because the system is a system, whether it's a biological system, a technological system, or a macrocosmic system, or a microcosmic system, or a linguistic system, or a mathematical system, the consistency through all of it is the systematic nature. And a systematized nature can then be expressed in language such as cybernetics, system dynamics, systems thinking, as well as the formally appreciated conduits that linguistics and mathematics are representative of. So, because language has so many ways of describing the sensorium's interface, and this is where I feel a reminder of mind-body dualism is a really important contextual reference point, is the idea that because mind-body dualism isn't necessarily confirmed, denied, or otherwise proven to have an absolute polarity, then we have to work upon the basis that consciousness itself, from our present perspective, is not necessarily physiological or psychological. Right? It's technically both. Consciousness technically has to be both, because consciousness is, as of yet, unspecified in its modality, and because its modality is technically unspecified, it cannot be exclusively physiological or psychological, which means it has to be technically both or neither, which would then start introducing the principle into a more quantum mechanic frame of reference. So without overstepping my levels of knowledge in the matter, a quantum mechanic frame of reference must include the possibility that the mechanics at work cannot function without being participants in a classical mechanics system, because classical and quantum mechanics are initially perceived from a dualistic perspective of mind and body, which means that classical and quantum mechanics, you could even argue, are the physical and psychological continuations of perception. In the same idea that physically, we are here, right? My finger touches the hand, it stops, it's perhaps a boundary of perception, perhaps it's a limitation of the mind. It might entirely be that we are simply beams of light within a computer simulation as per Bostrom's simulation hypothesis. At the same time, it could be entirely that what he's phrased as a computer-generated image might genuinely be a psychologically generated image of a sufficiently powerful cognitive emission source. Essentially, there might be a mind somewhere in our universe or a different universe that is simply that competently capable a thinker that we exist as a consequence. We might all be living in the imagination of a different animal. We might be able to reconstruct our reality via our imagination. So, we continue the idea of cosmological mechanics sharing classical and quantum properties. Then the idea that I then find fascinating is the psychological and physiological consistency between quantum and classical physics, because classical physics, to me, instantiates the possibility of rebuilding matter however we choose fit because of the technological limitations we presently encounter not being the infinite limitations as provided by reality. So, continuing that idea, is the psychological limitations we perceive to be given by reality might only be limitations as far as we feel the limitations and not necessarily literally limitations. So for instance, if you as a child are told you're not going to be this or that, you might encode that belief and believe it. It doesn't mean it's true. You might genuinely be able to win a Nobel Prize. You might genuinely be able to win the World Championships in your sport of choice. You might genuinely be competent enough to be the most popular best-selling musician of all time and be making the music you want to make, not just the music that the record label is asking you to create. The point I'm making is that limitation is a construct. So if we accept that limitation is a construct, classical mechanics defines that construct as an inevitability. Quantum mechanics, from my comprehension of it, admittedly my layman's comprehension of it, quantum limitation doesn't exist in the same intensity. It's because a quantum principle can and cannot exist and simultaneously exist and neither point existing all at the same time, effectively it becomes a matter of probability instead of potentiality. So if the probability of it happening is greater than zero, for instance, me winning multiple Nobel Prizes and accomplishing all of the objectives I've written down, whether they're in ink or in a digital notebook, then if that probability is greater than zero because of the quantum mechanics that our universe has provided, then we must accept the idea of belief, faith, imagination as scientifically valid expressions of quantum mechanics. And I would then continue the idea of saying if the continuation is that belief is a consistent idea within quantum mechanics, and physics consistently states that its theories of everything have not excluded the concept of consciousness as a necessary component of existence, being mindful of the anthropocentric potentiality of that statement, then it's entirely possible, if you think you can do it, you can do it. Now the interesting idea there is that there is neuroscientific research supporting that claim, something called Hebbian plasticity or cell assembly theory, same thing, different name, is often described very simplistically as neuroplasticity. So, because neuroplasticity is continuously something that humans have as part of their operating systems, however you want to define consciousness, that consistent point of reference that humans have is effectively that everything we think we are. It's not just what we think we become, it's what we think we are is what we are. It is literally that simple. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is because it is literally that simple. I'm not saying it's easy, it does get easier in the same way that if you go for a jog let's say you hit 5k on your first job, congratulations, and you hit 5.5k, then you hit 7, and you hit 11 and 13 prime number continuation, then yeah, eventually running's going to become easier and easier, and those jogs are going to, the initially difficult distances are going to become far more manageable. So the important component we're looking at here is that the linguistic and mathematical dichotomy of existence is actually a shared perspective of sensorium interface syntax. And I'm not trying to obfuscate what I'm thinking about through excessive language as much as I'm really trying to be as precise with my language as I can be, because I feel that the topic at hand necessitates precision. And the more fluently I can describe these ideas from multiple vernaculars, whether it be a computer science vernacular, an economic vernacular, linguistics, mathematics, neuroscience, physics, psychology, sociology, systems thinking from a variety of perspectives such as cybernetics, the more profoundly I can identify where the useful language is in that continuation of manifesting a reality, aka cosmologically interfacing with my environment in a constructive manner, aka altering my ontological conduct until being is essentially simplifying everything I'm doing by virtue of something such as Gauss' law, so that my seemingly complex system is actually incredibly simple. It just necessitates perception from something of a higher level of understanding. For instance, I need to upgrade my own mind. I need to run an update on myself, because then, as I update myself, it becomes easier for me to translate these ideas and convert the jargon from my most comprehensive understanding to a universally comprehensive understanding. And if I can unify the language from my understanding so that everybody can understand it to some degree, then that is me demonstrating that my level of knowledge is not simply linguistic. And I feel that happens sometimes with intelligent people, is that they learn enough words to know how to linguistically convey intelligence, not necessarily semantically display intelligence. And that you can know what you're talking about from a linguistic perspective and not necessarily know what you're talking about from a technical perspective. The thing is though, and this is what I find most fascinating, and again, I'm really not trying to meander around as much as I'm constructing my simplicical systems syntax thinking to be more inclusive of the various triangles and the tetrahedrons to becoming hypertetrahedrons in 5 cells, until eventually I'm thinking in 4D all of the time, and then can eventually start figuring out how to think in 5D, 6D, 7D, however far we can go. The idea in the same sense would be learning how to play a musical instrument with one hand, such as you've got a drum set in front of you, you've got, say you're playing in a classical position, you've got your left hand, right hand, right foot on the kick drum, left hand on the hi-hat pedal. You might just start with finding a time signature with your right hand, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you introduce the second half, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Simple pattern, and you do have 1, kick, 3, 4, 1, kick, 3, 4, 1, kick, 3, 4, 1, kick, 3, 4. Strange time signature, I know, but the idea is that the 4-4 pattern is a framework from which other patterns can be derived. And now I'm being reminded of my idea regarding music theory, string theory overlapping. But the idea is that if I've got 1, kick, 3, 4, 1, kick, kick, 2, 3, 4, 1, kick, 3, 4, kick, 2, 3, 4. Eventually, that overlap from that triangle of those three can then become, okay, with the hi-hat, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. that 3 being my hi-hat bit. So then it can eventually, you might hear this through the mic, I'm not sure, but I could have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you may have heard my feet doing little pitter-patters, sort of triplets, as if I had a double kick pedal. But the thing is, if you have a hi-hat in front of you, that little fizzle you can get on the hi-hat from having that quick foot action in time with the kick drum can create a crescendoing noise. It might not necessarily be aesthetically compatible with the music being played by the ensemble. However, the principle of the matter is that multimodal coordination is not just physical input to press the button, it's how are you pressing the button, which in economic linguistics would be comparable to the idea of ordinal and cardinal utility. That, okay, you can now correctly differentiate your forelimbs from each other and conduct them in such a manner that you're creating aesthetically pleasing output. And then you've got the subjective idea of what is aesthetically pleasing output. At the end of the day, if you enjoy the music you're making, you enjoy the music you're making. So, the more directly connected idea I have here is figuring out more precisely how what I'm expressing linguistically is being expressed in the most macrocosmic, ontologically precise manner, so that when I can zoom further into a more mechanistic appreciation of the efforts at work, such as understanding how waveforms of light can also behave as particles behave, so that when I'm thinking about this from a psychological perspective, is okay, so there's the confluence of biochemicals flowing through my system, there's also the electrical behavior from the neural oscillations that will have, as fluid dynamics and wave propagation respectively, fluid dynamics as well as wave propagation, having the shared mechanic of troughs and crests expressed via peak amplitude. Now that might not necessarily be a mechanic, but the principle of matter that I'm expressing is water and wind, well, light, water and wind all have that principle of waves about them, which means that is a consistently occurring Hello, Malcolm speaking. Hello. No. I've been receiving text messages from, I think, some sort of recruiter, but they're very odd. Anyway, as I was trying to explain, is when we think about cybernetic systems from either a first order or second order perspective, we're simultaneously integrating the physiological phenomena of our bodies with the psychological phenomena of our minds. So whether we describe that in the first order perspective as more of an outsider looking in and observing the world as a very surface level perspective, or from a second order cybernetics perspective of the insider looking out, being more at one with the universe and expressing it more as a intentionally aware dialogue with manifestation, as in everything you say is part of your engineering reality. It's every syllable you utter is part of its logistic logic conversion tool. So, for instance, every time you open your mouth, even if you're not deliberately uttering a discernible word in your language, you are also communicating with the universe because you are part of the universe. Differentiating human beings from ontological phenomena, and this is where it's a differential. The differential is not just being anthropocentric, it's being life form, being life. You are life, you are the universe, you are all those sorts of... The point I'm trying to make is every time you speak, you are conducting a cosmological operation. That's just the definitional consequence. So one of the reasons I find ratio-based combinatorics so prominently helpful in this regard is that if you consider a peak-to-peak waveform's amplitude to have numerical representation of either the trough or crest being 2 to 1, the central point being 1 to 1, and then the crest or trough being 1 to 2, depending on what behaviors are at work. So for instance, if it's a good behavior in consolidating from 2 to 1, you'd have to think, okay, so this is good behavior, that's good behavior, how do I combine these, or which am I prioritizing? And in the same sense, if you have a 1 to 2 from the trough and you're going up to the crest, as an idea of the crest being semantically defined as the better of the two ideas, then it might be, okay, I've got 1 to 2, I've got one thing doing really, really well, how can I make it better? Okay, if I bifurcate this idea, okay, just chop it in half, for instance, I'm eating my breakfast and I want to make this breakfast better, I can, 1, I could eat it outside, 2, I could eat it in good company, 3, I could eat it in a sense where I don't feel rushed, 4, I could improve the quality of the ingredients in the food I'm eating. Okay? So that immediately takes that what originally 1 to 2 to a 2 to 4 to a 4 to 8. Proportionally, the principle is still the same. And the way that I find that most directly helpful is that when we think about neural networks, biologically speaking, it's a continuation in semantically assigned proportion, as in it might not literally be an equidistribution of 25% responsibility for each neural tract involved in that behavioral operation. However, psychologically speaking, you can assign those values equal value, you can assign those labels equal value until, in the same sense of ordinal but utility of defining it as useful, until you can find the cardinal utility, which defines how much more useful, aka how much more valuable, A is from B is from C is from D. And in the same sense that then becomes of, okay, well maybe eating outside is great, eating with company is actually really, it's kind of great, but sometimes, but not all the time. Having better quality ingredients is obviously really helpful, and not feeling rushed, that's okay. But I'm not sure which of those is most helpful for improving the quality of this meal, because it might be in summertime that eating outside is way more enjoyable than eating outside during the middle of winter. If you're in the northern hemisphere and your winter is quite, so to say, rainy and windy, to put it gently, at which point you might more value having good company. At the same sense of that kinesic language of how you are eating your breakfast or your lunch or your dinner, whatever the meal may be, is a continuation of a behavioral cycle which can be expressed via ratios. Now, whilst that ratio might have a proportion of 1 to 2 becoming 4 to 8, there's obviously more numbers than just 2 and its root of exponents. It's root of exponents, it's exponentiation and or roots. The principle being that you could multiply the number by whatever you want of variables. So for instance, if it's 1 to 2, but then you think, I can think of one more idea. You've then got a 1 to 3. You can then triangulate that idea with something else. Maybe you go straight to a 3 to 9, or you connect it with a 1 to 3 to 3 and continue it and having it as a complex fraction or a complex fraction. And there's always various mathematical models of assigning value to cognitive functions as well as affective functions that help consolidate otherwise ambiguous terminology from what I've described as classical psychology which is more, I would think, equivalent with first order cybernetics, and then find equivalencies in second order cybernetics and what I describe as quantum psychology, because once you start understanding how your language is a continuous ontological event that has cosmological continuity, the fact that you're still alive means that you will continue manifesting things, so then you can use that as a barometer of your life's directionality. If you feel more alive and have more means of sustaining that feeling of aliveness, then you are in the correct direction. Then after you've defined that ordinal utility's directionality, in the same sense you could have negative numbers, positive numbers, and incorporate those into ratios or compound fractions as well, you can then further subdivide the principle into the thing that you understand it intuitively and you're trying to put it into words, trying to outwardly express it, you're trying to externalize the idea. Well, the thing is that specifically that externalization is itself a cosmological event. So this is when the mind-body dualism becomes so fascinating, is if I can externalize my physiology to such a wholesomely competent degree of precision that my external environment becomes a continuation of my internal environment's intention, aka if I do the things that make my surroundings do what my internal surroundings want them to do, pardon me, engineering to a degree, then it becomes further and further definable as a system, because the system of behavior I have employed to cause change then becomes a system from which I can identify the causes of change against Gall's law, which is successful complex systems exist because of successful simple systems. So for me, the simple system began with the idea of ratios and simplices. If I can find a 2-to-1, then I can figure out how to make 1-to-1s, or 2-to-2, or 3-to-3, or 5-to-5, 7-to-7. Big fan of prime numbers. Prime numbers are great. As well as finding the simplices. Okay, if I can find a triangle here with 3, and if I can find an idea conceptually of 3 items, which in a different ratio would constitute a 1 as a whole, then that 3 can then be bijectionally mapped of having a continuation. So if I have these 3 things here, and have them on 3 things here, then I could also, by definition, have the 3 things here continued into the idea of 3 things here, 3 things here, and then that overlapping idea then becomes how one of the ways a triangle can join tetrahedrons can join hypertetrahedrons, aka 5 cells, and they'll start connecting a more comprehensive, I see it now, for instance, in this case, checkmating pattern, aka a mating net, aka a reticulation system. And a reticulation system, you could even argue, is just a way of focusing on what you want to achieve, which is the purpose of the neural network, which in many cases is just staying alive. And then once you figure out how to stay alive, you start striving, and then you start thriving, and you continue that idea the whole way through. Okay, right. Time-wise, I need to go. I have a work thing to attend. I hope you'll really enjoy this. I've absolutely adored speaking about this today. I feel I'm getting far more fluent in my conversation. I feel I'm connecting ideas in ways I haven't before that are actually useful and valuable, and I just really enjoy having this format to express myself. So, if you enjoyed things, comment on the post, tell me what you're thinking, tell me what it's me to speak about. You can ask, not tell, ask me. Or you can tell if you want, it depends how strict you're feeling. Just ask respectfully and we'll see what we can do. Like the post, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, however you want to do it, you do what you want to do. Have a great life. Thanks, bye.